Welcome to the Church Safety and Security broadcast with the Church Safety Guys, sponsored by Checker. Background screens for your faith or volunteer organization. The Church Safety Guys is a nonprofit organization. Our mission is to inspire, influence, and impact church safety and security teams. We are protectors, guardians, ambassadors, and shepherds. We are about all things church safety and security, which starts with a ministry mindset and a servant's heart. Join us for the next hour as the Church Safety Guys unpack safety, security, leadership, and ministry operations with your hosts, James McGarvey and Mike Scully. This broadcast is also available on social media, YouTube, your favorite podcast platforms, and on the all-new Church Security app.
All right. Welcome to the Church Safety and Security broadcast with the Church Safety Guys. I am James, and I am joined on this outstanding broadcast by my co-host, Mike Scully.
Hello, sir. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. It feels like we haven't done this in
it's been a few weeks. Well, I'm not sure a year, but it definitely is longer than we're used to between sickness and what was in there, Father's Day, and we had 4th of July in there. So I think
we had two holidays back to back, and then your family got sick. I had Vacation Bible School that was like 12-hour days, and then I think I went on vacation. I actually had the opportunity to go on a cruise with my family, which is something we don't do very often, and we got back Sunday, and as soon as we got back Sunday night, we flew back from Florida. My youngest daughter was like, "Dad, I'm not really feeling good," and I'm like, "Stop it." And so then I think it was by Tuesday or Wednesday, we had full-blown COVID test boxes laying around, and my youngest daughter and my wife both got it really hard. And so thankfully, my wife, the doctor actually put her on some new medication, and she's doing very well. But it was really kind of weird because there's 5 of us, and I tested negative. I felt fine. So we've got in our house, Our house looks like a war zone. Like there's certain lines now where we're like, okay, don't go over by your, I'm like telling my other 2 kids, don't go over by your sister or your mom, because you might get sick.
We got the 3 littles, so quarantining or any sort of trying to keep germs to one part of the house versus the other really doesn't exactly work with the littles. Now it's, for us, it wasn't COVID, but yet it's still enough to knock us on our butt and kind of have a cough that's kind of really doesn't go away. And it's just weird symptoms. I mean, it's more plaguing symptoms of those symptoms, but yet then from a test perspective, it's not at least what they think is COVID, but who knows? Sure. It's between variant and subvariant and elemental P variant and this, that, and the other thing. It's like, who knows if the tests can even keep up with it. So,
well, and that's what, we're, as soon as my wife took a COVID test, and she had my daughter take one, and then I took one because I was running back and forth to the office. And of course we have a strong policy that says, if someone in your family tests positive or you test positive, you got to go back to working from home. So we're just, we're dealing with all of that. And then it clicked in my head this weekend. I think I had 3 or 4 major activities across both churches. And, I'm like, okay, so then I'm, my second phone call, it's not the doctor's office, it's actually the pastors of both churches. And I'm like, how do you want me to handle this? And they're like, well, you're not sick. And I'm like, no, according to the CDC's website, I can wear a mask and I'm fine, because they have a calculator now, because you have to have a certain layer of algebraic math in your I don't know, experiences to figure out when you're contagious versus when you're not. So
Up, down, down, left. You can go
yeah,
out.
well, I'm entering all this and I'm like, yes, the CDC says I'm good. I'm like, I just need to wear a mask. I'm fine. And both of the pastors looked at me and they're like, dude, just stay home. Like,
Yeah.
take some time, enjoy your family. And I'm like, we just got back from vacation. I'm like, I need to get back in the swing of
Right.
things.
Exactly. Well, I was tied up
So
at
it was
a
fun.
homeschool conference all weekend. So one of the largest in the southern United States, one of the big ones, happens to come right to the same city that I'm in, just
Nice.
outside Austin. So it was nice because we didn't have to drive far, but it also meant for a lot of different things going on between the
Oh,
wife
sure.
and myself. And so busy weekend for sure.
For sure. It's kind of like one of those things where I went, we had Friday night, we had a a big men's outreach and we were short security people. So I actually went over to the church and I stayed in my vehicle and just basically covered the outside perimeter and didn't talk to anybody, just kind of listened to the radio and watched stuff. And it was funny because one of the pastors came over to me and he's like, "You just can't stay away, can you?" And I'm like, "Well, you're coming up to me. I'm isolating in the parking lot, but
Yep.
you're
Glutton for punishment.
for sure." But anyhow, so this broadcast, we actually we're going to talk about the idea of keeping kids safe and children's ministry operations. And so a few, I, it's this year has really flown by. I was going
Yeah.
to say it's been pretty crazy. But a few months ago, I had the opportunity to meet a pastor out of Washington D.C., and he's a good friend with Jeff from ECAP. For those of you that remember, we had Jeff on, and then Jeff came down and spoke at our conference about keeping kids safe and that sort of thing. And so I had the opportunity to meet him in Kentucky at a luncheon, which was a great experience, and listened to him and asked him if he would consider joining us to talk through the idea of keeping kids safe. So joining us this evening is Pastor Deepak Raju. So welcome, sir. Thank you again for joining us.
Glad to be here. Glad to have some time with you guys.
Good to have you.
Well, we appreciate it. We know you're definitely a busy pastor, busy author. And I don't know, I think my schedule's crazy busy, but then I go online and you're always writing articles, you're always blogging, you're always working with different organizations. So it's very humbling to me. I'm like, how do you do it? in my mind. But anyhow, so thank you so much for joining us. The book that I referenced earlier was the one that I think you and Jeff gave me a copy of, but it's called On Guard. And I've really had the opportunity to kind of dive into it, and I'm part of the leadership team of a church plant, and so we're pulling a lot of ECAP's accreditation, a lot of Jeff's accreditation aspects in, because we're starting off fresh. And I'm very thankful that our senior pastor of the church plant used to be the family pastor and children's pastor of our sending church, who I've been attending for quite a few years. And so safety and security is a paramount. I mean, I've talked to Jeff and looked at my notes, and we're duplicating a lot of what we had, but what we had were things that you mentioned, in your book. And that was stuff that we were doing, 12 or 15 years ago. And everyone was laughing at us. Like, everyone was like, why do you do a check-in process? Why do you do background checks? All of this different stuff. And so now, when we say that, we're like, hey, the new church, this is what we want to do, and this is how we want to structure it. And of course, everyone's like, oh, absolutely. Why would you think that you don't want a background check or you don't want to screen people? But anyhow, so I wanted to kind of go through that content and kind of talk to you a little bit tonight about that. But for starters, if you would, for those that maybe don't know who you are, if you could just kind of go through your background and experience and what's kind of led you to this point in your ministry and in your life.
Yeah, thank you for that, James. I am a pastor in Washington, D.C. We're 5 blocks east of the Capitol building. We're a congregation about 800 in downtown D.C. We have about half the congregation single. A lot are young married, so we have lots of 20 and 30-year-olds. Our average age is typically around 30 to 31 to 32, which means lots of young kids in the congregation. So a Sunday morning, we can have anywhere from 200 to 250 kids, 0 through 6th grade, who are in our children's ministry. And that means we need a lot of volunteers and we need a lot of help, because that occupies 3 whole floors of the church building to be able to take care of what is a little city of children up there during our main services and our Sunday school hour during church. So I come at it two angles. I'm both the counseling pastor, which means I'm involved in all the hard things, the difficult marriages, the suicide, eating disorders, addictions. But of course, that involves the trauma and abuse related situations. The other side, my other cap, is pastor of family ministry, which means I'm the direct supervisor for the youth minister, the children's ministry director, and I'm their boss, so to speak. So I get in the trenches with them, talk through things. So the book came as a merger of my 2 worlds together, and my seeing all the things that go wrong in a fallen world as a counseling pastor, and my coming and seeing some of the really good things they were doing, but realizing I wanted to build up even more of a firewall for the sake of protecting and preventing against abuse overall. So that's where it all started, me actually in that role, trying to figure out for our own local church, what do we need to do? Realizing we were doing some things, and then there were a few things where I thought, oh, well, should we be doing this, this, and this? And that started me reading, researching, looking, thinking through what other things would strengthen our ability to prevent abuse, and what do we need to do? How do we need to train in order to be able to respond to abuse if it ever happened within our congregation?
For sure. It's kind of an interesting dynamic for the church to put that together, I guess, as the family pastor and then also counseling. But it kind of makes sense from the standpoint of, from a safety perspective, if you have the opportunity, obviously, to counsel and be gracious and share the love of Christ with people and help them through what they're dealing with. But at the same time, you can see the fallenness of sin and man and shift gears and say, we want to protect the vulnerable at our church at the same time, and kind of apply and bring things over. So that's kind of a cool situation.
It's God's positioned you with a optimal vantage point from 2 different angles. And when you combine those 2 different views, it creates kind of a different vantage point that the average person does not have, because they're not either not going to have the piece of context that you get as a counselor, or get it as the deeper family pastor engaged heavily with the children's ministries. So that's great.
Yeah, and you guys are right in the sense of, like, anything I get on the counseling side causes me to rewind and look at my present circumstances and be able to say, and I've applied this both to our own personal family and then to our church family. You see things go wrong in a fallen world. So, for example, we have lots of young adults who come forward in a counseling ministry, talk about difficult things like trauma and abuse that they went through growing up. It makes you begin to ask the question, okay, what do I need to do to make sure now the kids who are in our context don't have to face those same things? And obviously we can't protect kids from everything in a fallen world,
Right.
but we can make
Right.
some wise choices to help do everything we can to protect against evil.
But many of those that you're counseling currently today that had that childhood, had that past, you have an opportunity to change their future because they will at some point likely be parents, and you
Yeah.
don't want that to carry on generationally.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. Well, and then that's part of the healing process and seeing the gospel applied to those lives, working patiently with them as they work through their issues over time and be able to break the cycle that shows
Mhm.
up in the next generation in their family. But then, every difficult case I deal with, I walk across the street and say, how do I help my own kids? And every
Sure.
difficult thing I deal with, I try and think as a pastor, like, how do we help the kids, the 250 kids entrusted to our care, 0 through 6th grade, which means we read, we researched, we interviewed, we had a lot of conversations to figure out what we need to do. And there was a few precipitating events that then caused us to realize. So I went to a children's ministry conference geared for people who are doing that kind of work in a local church. And I was dumbfounded that everyone on the stage was either a lawyer or some
Hmm.
kind of professional expert. But there's nobody who worked for a local church that
Interesting.
was actually speaking about children's ministry and how to handle it. So I just kind of thought, and this is the first children's safety conference we'd ever gone to, where there were safety experts and there were lawyers and there were medical people, but there was no pastor or no children's ministry director on the stage. I
Huh.
thought that I kind of put a footnote in my mind thinking, well, I loved all the things. I'm grateful for all the things they're saying, but none of them
Sure.
are working for a local church
Right?
in
They
that
don't
sense.
have that last mile context.
Yeah. Well, and then the other thing that happened is we had a chance to talk to Anna Salters, who is the secular expert on sexual offenders.
Mhm.
She's a world recognized expert, and we had read her material, so we had to call her to ask a few questions to think through some things. And you pay an expert per hour for their
Sure.
consulting time. I had 10 minutes left of the time we had spent to pay for her. So I just went ahead and asked her, tell me what you think about churches and their protection of children. And she just went off. She just started
Wow.
listing all the troubles and all the problems she's seen in churches. And that was
Mhm.
the other thing that kind of put a footnote in the back of my mind, thinking, okay, well, the world renowned expert in sexual offenders and this safety conference for children's ministry folks, there's no
Mm.
pastor or children's
Hmm.
ministry director speaking in. So once we finished our research, thought about our firewall, rewrote our child protection policy, implemented,
Mhm.
learned how to do it, then the question came up like, okay, now can we help other churches with what we've learned, which is what brought about the book.
For sure. So, what would you say? I mean, for you personally, seeing that, what would you say the largest opportunity for churches in this area is today?
Yeah, there's a lot of things. Well, number one, like begin to just re-examine what they're doing.
Mhm.
Because in a culture right now, this is a hot topic, like abuse and trauma.
Sure.
The Me Too movement has brought a cultural awareness to this that, like you guys mentioned earlier, didn't exist 15 or 20 years ago
Sure.
overall. So there's a lot more people who are sensitive to the topic. But, I just had
Mm.
a friend who reached out to me and said, hey, we're looking at this homeschool group, but when we called, we asked them questions about their child safety protection policies, and they had nothing. And I said to him, sorry, friend, but I'm afraid this is fairly normal.
Yeah.
So you do need to ask hard questions and figure out what is being done. There's a lot of churches that are like that too, that
Sure.
they make assumptions like, we know everyone here, no one would ever do this in our church.
Mhm.
We are prepared in any sense of needing to deal with things. Like there's a lot of false assumptions that people
Sure.
make when it comes to child safety. And so you just need to ask questions. You need to ask your pastor, ask the children's ministry director. There's a lot of opportunities to create child safety measures and execute them that a lot of churches are not doing. If you actually lift up the hood and look underneath the hood, I think you'll be surprised at how many churches are not doing that much. But I think you'll be delighted to see how many churches are now beginning to execute and actually doing good work and trying to figure out how to have a decent firewall to protect their kids.
For sure. I think it's interesting. I have the opportunity usually about once a year, and then I have the opportunity to talk to local churches very often about protecting kids and background checks and different things like that. But in my own church, I think it's interesting. Usually once a year, I have an opportunity to address the children's workers, and I'll open up for discussion the sessions, and I'll say, okay, I'm the safety director of my church. What would you like to ask me? And oftentimes, it's crickets. And I'll say, well, let's talk about signs of physical or sexual abuse. And they all look at me like I'm crazy. And I'll have that conversation, and I'll say, do you know that I'm in Ohio, but do you know that by Ohio law, churches are required to report if they suspect something? There's no patience or tolerance anymore for ignorance of not understanding that you are supposed to report something. And it's 9 times out of 10, I get the deer in the headlights look, where an individual's like, well, no, that would never happen here. I mean, that's what we have a safety team for. And I'm like, but you were working hands-on in that Sunday school classroom with those children. You see more than I do. I respond as like in a first responder capacity when something goes wrong. But what can we do before something goes wrong to make sure that doesn't happen, and that that doesn't go wrong? And so it's always interesting to me that people and that was one of the things that I had on my list to ask you later, was the false assumptions, because it seems like we just get, I know both Mike and I hear that all the time from churches, that it's like, well, that can never happen here. That's great. I know everybody. We don't need to do background checks because I know all 150 people at my church. And I'm like, you know what? My job Monday through Friday is to work for the Defense Department. I still get background checks and don't often talk about my job, but when I go to church, I get a background check like everyone else does, to be consistent, because I'm following that policy. So it's interesting for sure.
Well, and yeah, the killer is, just to follow up on that thought, child safety organizations, the secular community, have very clear standards in response to everything that's been happening in the Me Too culture. And
Sure.
often, sadly, the church is behind. So, well, a lot of my arguments would be, well, if the secular community would adhere to these standards because they understand evil in a fallen world, why would the church actually be any less than what they're doing? If nothing else, we want to do more to show how we value children and how we see them as image bearers that are precious in God's sight. And to assume that nothing would happen to you is just folly. So the sad thing is,
Sure.
ever since I wrote the book, I get the crisis calls after something's happened.
Mm-hmm.
That's the thing that I started getting more calls for than I ever expected. It's
Mm-hmm.
not the people who nothing has happened and therefore they don't care about it. It's actually the people something has happened, and now they're responding with their head spinning, not knowing what to do because they never took the time to get out ahead of the problem and
Sure.
understand how to, number one, prevent it, but number two, how to be prepared in case something happens. So can I give you a typical scenario that
Yeah,
people are not
absolutely.
ready for, that, it shows me, well, at least it showed us we weren't ready. If a sexual offender walks through your doors, do you know what you're going to do when he's now
Mm-hmm.
on your premises attending a service? Because when we rewrote our child protection policy, I read through 15 or 20 policies throughout the country. I had friends send me their policies. And what was shocking is that a lot of them didn't have sections on abuse, but also none of them, absolutely none of them, had anything about what to do when a sexual offender walks in your building.
Mm-hmm.
And we got caught off guard when a sexual offender showed up, and we you know, the work of the Spirit, one of our deacons just has this kind of sixth sense, and he knew there's something going on here. So he
Sure.
tagged with the guy, and then we did some research, reaching out to the church that the guy had told us he was previously from, found out from his former pastor that he was actually being prosecuted for child pornography in court at that time.
Hmm.
So thank goodness that deacon, you know, had enough sense to just track with it because he suspected something. And then we did our due diligence, and we even looked up online. I went to our interim children's minister at that point. I said, I want you to go through all the databases that are available and see if we could find this guy through the databases that are there. But, you know, the reality is, like, unless the guy was actually charged,
Right.
we couldn't catch him through the limited databases we were employing. And there are actually certain screening services that would catch him, but we hadn't chosen those options yet.
Sure.
But it was a learning experience for us. Like, okay, number one, I never want to be caught off guard again. I want to make sure we have a plan, not for every scenario, because we can't plan for infinite number of scenarios.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
There are a number of different scenarios that could happen that we can be prepared for. And so we went back and we did our research. We called, we talked to professionals, and we figured out a policy that would prepare us for the next time around. And guess what? Within the next few years, we had other sexual offenders show up, and we were
Right.
ready the second time it happened and the third time it happened. We were able to execute a policy that we had in place rather than responding ad hoc. And that was the best part about it. If there's a policy in place, as soon as the situation shows up, you don't have to think about it. Now we just need to merely execute because
Yep.
we've thought
Right.
about the best practices. We've consulted with experts already. We know how best to respond. And so now we just kick in our plan. And that removes all kinds of confusion because I can then tell everybody, here's our steps. We've already reviewed this previously. Now it's time to execute. And everybody jumped in and we followed through with the plan that we already had. That's just one practical example of like safety and having protocols for situations that could happen within your church context.
For sure. We actually, it's funny you use that example because we had something extremely similar happen in our church, and we went through the same process. Honestly, like we had not discussed we had not discussed having or how to handle having a sexual predator come in and worship, and someone that was charged and that was known, and they weren't serving in a capacity where we would do a background check to see that. But it just so happened that the individual that brought them made the comment to one of the pastors and said, this individual was charged and just did some jail time, and now they're out and they're trying to change their life around. And the pastor actually commented and said, what do you mind me asking, like, what were the charges? And he commented that it was sexual assault with a minor. And so the pastor was like, okay, well, if you'd like to continue to come, we need to sit down and we need to have a conversation about this. And so it was interesting because I was pulled into that conversation from the safety standpoint of, what are you seeing other churches do? What are, like, because we didn't have a policy or we didn't have anything written down. And I was kind of standing there at that point, pulling my hair out, like, we need to have something because this just happened and it's going to happen again. So, let's put together a process of how we're going to move through this. And we did. And I'm grateful because I've been attending this church now for just over 15 years, and the pastors are extremely God-fearing individuals that have a heart for children, have a heart for kids ministries. And, that's one of the reasons that drew us, initially 15 years ago, that drew us to that church, was the priority that they placed on children's ministries and safety, because we had little kids and we wanted, our kids to grow up in that environment. But it was interesting. It was definitely eye-opening for us, because we got to that point where after we were all, after the policy was changed, I'm like, okay, this is what we're doing from here on out. And that's how we're going to handle it. So interesting stuff
two
for
quick
sure.
thoughts from what
Go
you
ahead.
said there, Deepak. Two things that I picked up on, or actually three, if we go all the way back. One, you have more kids in your student ministry and kids ministry than many folks have in their entire church as their entire congregation. So the size that we're talking is just is sheer large volume, something picked up on earlier. But also going back to the background checks, is they're not perfect. Not everything is going to get caught. And I try to explain that to folks. They think that it's the be all end all. And I'm like, well, you can buy a lemon and a car that's been totaled and it doesn't show up on the Carfax. And so the thing is, not even Carfax catches all the things that happen to that car. So how would you catch it to a person that didn't necessarily go through a court of law or something happened? And so the lack of anything to report on either the car or the person doesn't mean that they're perfect. It just means that there's nothing to report. So that doesn't give you always want to inspect everything on a regular basis. And praise God that deacon had that sixth sense, or that see something and say something, or let's at least do something, because if something doesn't look right or something doesn't feel right. And I think that's the standard we talk about a lot in church safety and security, is that's all it starts with, is literally if it is outside of normal, outside of baseline, that is what is enough to start questioning. And if you question and gain context, now you can decide, okay, is there something we need to act upon here? Or was it just some sort of anomaly? But that's really the standard. And it's good that your deacon was able to pick up on that.
Yeah. Just to follow up on that thought, Mike,
Sure.
you're right. The background checks only catch a certain percentage. And I forget the numbers, but there's something like 10 to 20%. It's a fairly small percentage of people who are convicted, which puts an emphasis on the importance of knowing the people who are serving.
Right.
Like if you're going to put them in front of the kids, you got to know who you're putting in front of them, because sexual offenders are looking for they're not looking for big hurdles. They're looking for an easy access to kids. And so they'll do the grooming work. They'll pursue. But if you put up a lot of hurdles, you make it difficult. Well, guess what? There are 5 churches down the road who don't screen, who don't put up any hurdles. They're going to look for an easy target. That's what Anna Salters. That's one of the first things she taught me as we read her material and talked to her. That that offenders, predators, known predators, are looking for easy ways to abuse children. So we were required by our insurance policy to wait 6 months before we allow someone to be able to be with the children. And I've been in ministry for a while. I remember when the Catholic scandals came down in the Catholic Church, and what you saw was a wave of changes in insurance policies. Because I remember being at a different church where we had to sign a piece of paper consenting that we would wait for the volunteers to wait before we'd put people in front of the children a certain number of months. Church insurance policies began requiring a buffer period. But the flip side of that, the point of that, is not immediately letting people rush to being with the kids, but creating an opportunity for us to get to know the people who will be with our kids, which is why background checks don't actually, they're not bulletproof. They actually have a lot of gaps in them, which is why you do reference checks, you do interviews, but more importantly, you get to know the people in your church. Like gospel community means you actually have real relationships with people. You don't put a mask on when you show up on Sunday morning and just pretend to live the Christian life. So if you actually have genuine Christian relationships, now the counseling side of me is coming out here.
That's okay. I was just gonna say that's a gold nugget right there.
Yeah, but
Mike.
like gospel community allows us to actually be real people in the
Sure.
context of real community, where my hurts, my pains, my sorrows, my joys are really known by other people, so that when there's somebody who's being offered an opportunity, I want as a pastor to be able to say, that man or woman are not in a good spot right now, and
Sure.
I don't need a warm body in children's ministry.
Right.
I need them actually to be in the services for the sake of their own soul's sake, and we're going to go recruit somebody else right now.
Yeah.
And I can do that because we know the people in our church.
That's
Overall.
exactly, I mean, honestly, that's exactly what we say in safety and security too. There needs to be a time frame where the individual is gotten to know better. Like they can't just come into the church and all of a sudden be placed in that role.
Right.
There has to be, at our church, it's 6 months to a year. And then beyond that, there's also the requirement, which this kind of goes back to your point of screening, what you mentioned earlier, but we have a requirement of church membership for the sake of agreeing to honor the leadership of the church and abide by their guidance and their counsel biblically. And then the other piece of it is the screening process and the application. We don't, and I've said that, I think I've said that to church after church, is that I would much rather have a smaller ministry than have a large ministry and not have connections with the people that I'm serving with to know 100% that that those are solid individuals. And we run into, I actually, in December, I put together a book on mental health with church safety and security. And some of my research, I was running into the reality that it's the same thing. I don't want someone serving if they're not mentally, spiritually, and physically capable to serve. And if they're dealing with something at home, then they need to be sitting in the sanctuary, and they need to be guided and discipled through the process of understanding and knowing what they need to know better and being coached, etc. So,
quick thought on the screening piece real quick is that as you're going through not only that screening, it's not just that background check, is the importance of actually calling references and doing the research. Just because the worksheet or questionnaire is not blank and they actually took the time to fill in a reference doesn't mean that that's enough to check it off. You actually got to follow through and reach that person, have a conversation, or that reference is useless.
Yep. Yeah. And actually, our children's ministry director loves that reference because that actually gives her information about them that turns out to be useful to figure out. Because we'll get information like, oh yeah, this person was very involved. They taught this class. They were really good with kids. And we realized, we could put them in childcare, but this second grade class needs a teacher. They would be a great person. So there's lots of reasons to follow through with the reference. It gives you important information on the people you're getting to know. Now, I just want to highlight one thing, James, you had said on membership. A lot of churches don't have membership. And I think there's two firewalls. One's the normal screening you do for the childcare process when it comes to application and screening. But if you actually have church membership, you have a precursor to that process where the pastors of the church are getting to know the people who are committing to the congregation. And that's two hurdles a predator needs to leap over.
Right.
When down the street, they can go to this church where they can do an altar, go down the aisle after an altar call, join the church, and be teaching the children's choir 2 weeks later. Yeah. So which one's the predator going to go to? We have a 6-session membership class plus an interview, and that's just to get in the church. Then you go through a screening process and a training for children's ministry. So you could fool us. We're not beyond fooling. Somebody could work the system to try and get out on the other side. But that's a lot of work when you have 100 churches out there not doing anything, and they can easily have access to kids overall. So I think membership is another valuable way to know
absolutely. Well, and it's I believe, and I go back to, like, people ask me why I do that and why I push screening and that sort of thing, and why I'm very involved with that process. And I go back to, I spent about 15 years in retail, and in HR. And what was interesting to me is we used to have to hire people for fourth quarter for Christmas, right?
Yeah.
So we would bulk hire people, and what I always started doing was, I was tired of hiring people that would walk out the next day, right? So I started looking at body language, personality, all of that, and pulling that in, and kind of
Yeah.
throwing them little curveballs. Even something as simple as walking from the front of the store back to my office, I knew by the time we got back to my office if that person was going to work out, if I was going to hire them, if I was going to offer them a job. And one of the guys that I study a lot is Walt Disney. And Walt Disney used to do the exact same thing. He would walk the theme park and watch. If an employee picked up trash, then he knew that they were really wanting to be there, like they valued that opportunity.
Yeah.
And so, to me, when I pull that back into church safety, and we add that screening someone, if a pastor has those steps, or if an individual in church leadership has those hurdles that you mentioned to go through, then they need to be relying on the Holy Spirit to use those hurdles to be able to put up a red flag, or doesn't look right, as we call it, a DLR, that, okay, wait a second, something's not right here. I need to investigate this further before we get to that point of bringing this person in. And it's not, it can be done graciously. This isn't a lock up lock up the gate at the
Yep.
road. This is, let's help the person and bring them back in, but also protect the rest of the members that are here, and make sure that this is taken care of, and everything is running in a good, smooth process and pattern. So
Yeah. Well, and most of the people we're going to do the screening and they're going to be fine. But there is a small percentage of folks where there are going to be a variety of reasons we're going to probably say it's probably not the best ministry for you to serve in.
right.
And that could be they're not in a good place spiritually, and therefore I don't want to pull them out of the service. That could be, there's something about their life that we're not sure would be a good match with children's ministry right now. And so
Mhm.
therefore, as a pastor, saying, there's 1,000 other places to serve.
Right.
You don't take personal offense to this, like serve faithfully in other areas. And for the sake of the parents and for the sake of us, we think it's not a good
Sure.
match. That's why you take the time to screen.
And that's a standard thing that we've gotten to the point of saying as well. And it's just an open conversation. It's not aggressive, it's not mean, it's not rude. It's, hey, you know what? Based on your background, we love the fact that God's working in your life, but this over here is not the right ministry for you right now, because we feel like, you need a little bit more development and more coaching. How about this ministry? And how can we navigate that and do that? So great stuff for sure.
Do you want me to give
Oh, go ahead.
you a really tangible kind of example or two? Because people would think we're kind of talking a little vague. And they're like,
Sure.
who would you screen out? Just to give a specific.
Yeah,
Hey,
absolutely. Go for it.
yeah, like, just to give a sense of, I think 95% of the people who apply, we work through the whole process and it's fine.
Right.
There's
Right.
like 1 to 2 to 5% where, say, for example, we had a guy who came out. He wasn't a sexual offender, but he came out of prison,
Mhm.
out of some really difficult things in his past, and he had a radical turnaround. We had a guy who had a very difficult past regards to sexual sin and a pretty addictive and graphic lifestyle. And
Mhm.
I said to both those guys when they came in, you could serve. I think you're genuinely born again. I think it would be fine. I'd be fine for you to be in there, but I know if something went wrong in the room,
Right.
then you're in an awkward position because of your background.
Right.
And so therefore, for your sake, to protect your reputation and to
Right.
not ever put you in that compromised position, why don't you just pick one of the 19 other ministries we have
Exactly.
Sure.
that doesn't have any issue like this? So ushering, parking lot ministry, safety ministry out around the boundaries of the church, hospitality, driving seniors to church. There's dozens of other ways to serve
Sure.
that
Right.
don't put you in an awkward position. And as long as you do it lovingly in a gracious way, they understand you're there to protect their reputation, along with like getting them out of awkward positions they could be in later on. And both
Right.
those guys took it very graciously when they knew when they knew me and knew I'm loving,
Right.
I'm doing this in a loving and gracious way because I'm committed to them and I'm
Right.
committed to their spiritual good.
It's great.
Yeah, it is. So what are I think it's like 90% or 95% of the churches in the US are under the number of, what is it, 200, Mike?
250
250,
even, I think it
something like
was.
that
Yeah.
in church size. And oftentimes I know that what we do in a large church, we don't necessarily do in a small church.
Yeah, that's right.
But I just like to throw that question out to you. What are some things, what are some strategies that a smaller church can do to start off protecting their kids and protecting folks and be simple, not overwhelming,
Yeah.
but still be safe?
Yeah, the most basic thing that we ever recommend is a child protection policy.
Mhm.
And a policy is a self-imposed set of guidelines that a church decides on that defines a safe environment for the kids. That's a quick summary sentence of what we're talking about, recognizing
Sure.
that a 50-person church, a 200-person church, a 500-person church, a 1,000-person church, they're all going to have different versions of policies because they have different needs and different demands and different requirements and different laws within their own geographical area that they're actually having to negotiate. So
Right.
figuring out what that is for their setting is really important. I think that's really the first step. And how do you figure that out? Well, read like the book that I recommended. There's sample questions in the back. There's a whole section on
Yep.
a child protection policy that's in there. Then talk to Jeff Dalrymple and ECAP. They have lots of samples that they give out to churches to help them figure out where to start. And then find a few gospel preaching churches that are about your size that have
Right.
already done this work and ask them for samples of their policies. What you should not do is take someone else's policy, cut and paste your church's name and stick it in there.
Right.
And that's what a lot of churches tend to do.
Sure.
But then they find out that their policy actually doesn't match everything that they're trying to do. And
Right.
they get in trouble because what policy you choose to have, you actually need to follow through with. Otherwise,
Mhm.
you create greater liability for yourself. So if you put it down on
Absolutely.
paper and say, this is our policy, if something goes wrong, the judge won't hold you to the standard of what goes wrong. He'll hold you to the standard of what policies did you have in place and
Right.
how did you execute those policies. So in a fallen world, I can't prevent abuse in every situation. I can adjust things and build best practices to reduce the risk, and that's what we're doing overall. But even though it's even then, it's just reducing the risk. Somebody
Right.
could make it through all of our firewalls and abuse the child. And what the judge is going to say is, to the best of our knowledge, did we use all the best practices to protect
Right.
against this kind of abuse? And therefore, with that in mind, what kind of liability should we then bear? We're in a
Right.
much better position if we follow through versus if we created this huge policy and we didn't follow through and then something happened. Then we put
Right.
ourselves in a worse position by creating this elaborate plan and not actually doing what we said we'd do. So whatever you do, make sure you follow through, which means if it needs to be more basic, do that. Now, when people read the book, they see I've laid out a number of strategies. I just want everyone who's listening to know that's the Cadillac. Like
Sure.
if you want everything imaginable in your arsenal, I'm going to try and lay it out there for you. But I have church planners show up and say, we don't have enough volunteers. We don't have help to do everything you're describing. Well, of course you don't. You're a Christian.
Right.
You're just getting off the ground. You got people like rolling out chairs on Sunday morning, and people putting up banners, people printing bulletins. So you don't have enough people to do all of that. So therefore, pick what you can do and start small and
Right.
do the best you can with what you got. I think that's what most churches need to do. Pray through
Yeah.
it. Don't pick the Cadillac and then disappoint people or get
Right.
yourself in trouble with your policy.
Right.
Pick a few of the strategies that we lay out in the book and then do the best you can with what you've got. We always talk about start small, take on what you can handle, and then pray. And the Lord will bless that and will help you to grow over the course of time as the Lord brings more people and builds the church and grows your understanding and helps you grow in your knowledge of how to do this well over the course of time. Now, a large church might be able to say, hey, we can do all this. We got the resources, the time, and the people. Great. That's great. And I mean, expect that out of larger churches. But most churches under 200 actually have the kind of limitations that require them to choose a few things, not everything that you could ever imagine that's laid out in the book.
The real difference is it's not a checklist per se, it's a journey of maturity.
Yeah,
And
that's a
each
great way to put
church has to really kind of enter that journey and understand that they can take in bits and pieces, to your point, and grow in how intense or how detailed that then becomes. And the worst thing you can do would be to not step foot on that journey. The best thing you can do is to get started. Then it's continuous improvement over time.
Yeah. And you'd be surprised. 5 years in, and 10 years in, and 15 years in, you'll look back and thought, wow, look at how far we've come. And,
Right.
and simple and basic adjustments and improvements every year. If you come back and you say, okay, this is where we've been. Okay, now how do we improve what we're doing? One more step. If you do that every year, you'll be really surprised at 10 to 15 years in where you've actually come compared to where you began.
For sure. Well, for sake of time, I think we probably need to wrap it up or come close to wrapping it up, unfortunately. But one last question real quick for you, sir. I know we haven't really talked about too much about what happens if something bad does happen, like responding to the abuse piece of it. And I know there's a very solid section in your book about that. What are some things that I guess briefly that you would just mention for folks that maybe have gone through that as far as encouragement to move forward and do things different, or how to respond to it?
Yeah, good questions. Great questions. Yeah, number one, you want to think through the reporting angle of it. You want to understand the laws of reporting in your state, in your county. You want to get to know the professionals, police, CPS, other professionals that can be partners with your church in thinking through reporting. And then you want to also think through a process in your own church of evaluating accusations when they show up, so you can make decisions in regards to obeying the law, reporting abuse, and other things like that. That's the first side of it. That's the kind of child protection reporting, following up on accusations of abuse, working through a process that's good for the church. And just to say, you see me in the homeschooling room with the maps and everything back here. Homeschooling families tend to be paranoid when we get into this conversation, because they're scared about, obviously, the unholy word of CPS. They're scared of what CPS showing up at their door and doing anything. But I think Romans 13 talks about the importance of us partnering with the government who is empowered with the sword to protect. And therefore, we need not be scared to partner when there is abuse and figure out the ways that we should be reporting as a church. So there's a whole section on reporting and CPS and working with police and on things like that within the book. The other side of it is caring for the abused and dealing with the abuser. And there's a lot there, but important to understand and know who are the professionals, like professional counselors, who have training in abuse and trauma, who can partner with a victim and a church to help them think through how best to care for the victim. Good to not just respond when it happens, but to build out the DNA in your church, what it looks like to care for hurting people long before abuse occurs. So I want our members not to just simply respond to bad things. I want them to train and learn what it means to have a theology of suffering and know what it means to come into really hard, difficult things in a fallen world, like abuse and the evil that comes from evil that brings about abuse, and know how to be a godly influence in those situations overall. So then to partner with trained professionals like counselors and the pastors in doing it. And then the last part would be pastors not responding in crisis, but being equipped for these things long before they happen, which means they need to read, think together, pray about this. They need to figure out what professionals in their community, counselors, police, CPS, that they can partner with. And they need to train themselves. They need to be equipped to learn how to be ready when a situation like this happens. Because the kind of call that I don't want to have to do is a pastor who is having a panic attack because he's never encountered anything like this, and he just doesn't know what to do. And he's sinking under the pressure of not knowing how to respond to the abuse, deal with the predator, and actually care for the parents in the congregation who are now really concerned that this has happened within their church. So you don't want to be in that position. You want to get out ahead of it and get equipped as a pastor. That's just some of the things I would say. Like, there's a lot more detail to what we do, but that lays out some of the kind of parameters that we need to think about in order to think about how to respond to abuse.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and I want to go back real quick to the factor that you mentioned about CPS. And I think that I actually grew up homeschooled. My parents homeschooled me in New England, and I think I've turned out okay. But that was
seem pretty good, James. You seem
thanks.
just fine.
that was back in the reasoning, homeschooling, the perception and the reality of it has changed drastically over the years. And I think originally when my parents homeschooled me, it was under the specific guise of wanting to not wanting to have more of a religious influence. That was like the number one thing. It wasn't because I wasn't learning or didn't, whereas today I know a lot of folks pull kids out because of learning concerns or special needs, or they want to focus on different things better. And that's absolutely fine. But I think I remember back when I was being homeschooled, how we were fearful, like you mentioned, about CPS showing up, and it was a different title, but it was the same organization, that they were going to randomly pull kids away from people and all this stuff. And I think that I love the fact that you referenced that with a scripture verse of partnering and working with the government, because in a church type situation, there's liability concerns everywhere, right? Yeah. And the reality is, it is so easy and so simple for someone to come back and say, well, Pastor, sir, why did you do this in this choice, but in this situation you did this over here? And sometimes that can be explained, and sometimes it can't, because you can't share all of the information because of what the situation is and what's going on. But that I kind of feel like, and I've dealt with this at my own church, but I kind of feel like we need to maybe there's opportunity to bring those folks in and do like a training session or something and say, hey, this is how you would handle it. This is how you work with us. Because I feel like every time I say, yeah, you need to call this 800 number, CPS will come out, they'll interview you, they'll talk to the family, everybody just like gasps. And it's like, how could you? And the whole perception and mentality is that it's evil. And the reality is that you're trying to help the situation and prevent something worse from continuing to happen, and put a roadblock in there. So I just think it's interesting, and that was my point. Just to go back to I love the fact that you incorporated Romans, the passage in Romans, in with that, because I feel like that's very applicable to what we're regularly needing to remind our folks that, these are government services. Are they all bad? No, they're not. Maybe they're misused on occasion, just like any other service or that sort of thing is. But the reality is that we also, for liability's sake, need to have things documented. We need to do things the right way to be above reproach across the board.
Yeah,
And
which is why in the case of abuse, that we need to be willing to partner with the organizations that the government has created to help us deal with evil in a fallen world, recognizing that every institution has its problems.
Sure.
And so does CPS mess up plenty of times? Yes. I mean, there are lots of documented situations in regards to homeschooling where CPS oversteps their bounds.
Right.
But does that mean I throw the baby out with the bathwater, discard CPS as a whole? No, actually, there's a lot of situations where I think this is one of the arms of the government to use to actually get their expertise in when abuse really does happen.
Yeah.
And help us actually get out ahead of it and deal with it in a way that a lot of churches mess up.
Right. And I think you covered a great point there, and we've talked about it with safety and security standpoint of meeting the responding officers that may be on the beat for your church on a Sunday morning.
Yeah.
Understanding who are the shift sergeants of your police department, understanding fire and EMS. Have they trained in your building? Do they know what you're building? All of those matter. So the idea being is it's not physically just the checkbox of have you met these people. The goal is meet a relationship built a relationship with these people and meet them so that when the crisis does happen and you're dialing as a result of something that is happening currently or has happened and you're trying to clean up after, now you have a relationship with these folks, and it's not hey, I'm so-and-so. You're not meeting for the first time under duress of that situation. You're literally already have met them. You've had a chance to kind of get to know each other a little bit. And so now you understand what their job is, what they can understand your role in their church, how that works, and hopefully present a situation that isn't going to create angst or animosity, but create a situation where ends up with the ultimate form of care.
Well, and if you call the CPS department in your area, your county, your district, whatever it is you're in, and you said our church would like to get to know someone on your staff so that we can think more wisely of how to prevent abuse. So can we take someone out to lunch and ask them questions? They would drop their coffee and fall out of their chair. They would be shocked that somebody's thinking that far in advance and doing the proactive work to be ready for exactly the situation Mike's describing.
Right.
Overall. So especially smaller churches and smaller communities actually have a better chance at building a relationship than we do in big church, big city, where they tend to ignore us. So there are advantages of being a smaller church where you're more connected with your community. This is exactly the kind of scenario where you do want to know the policemen and the firemen and the EMS and the social workers so that you can be ready for all the emergency scenarios that do happen.
For sure. Well, Mike, did you want to add anything in wrapping up?
Well, I think there's so much that we've covered, which is great, and I know there's so much in that book, and appreciate the A coming on and B so much that's there. And I think I just go back to a point I made earlier. I think it's a journey, it's a progression, it's something that for the folks just getting started, it can be overwhelming. There's so much here. And they may realize that parts of keeping kids safe may not be their wheelhouse, but that's fine. They can find others in their church and partner with them and put together a committee and or a program around this and understand what folks can work in different spaces. Not everybody is going to come to the table being a counselor. Not everybody is going to come with a safety and security background. Some may come as a children's minister or may come as just a children's worker. But at the end of the day, if they're willing to sit down together and say, hey, we want to deliberately work together to do better and to protect our kids, how do we get started? I think your book gives a great way for them to start to unpack that.
Thank you, Mike. And I wrote it for any lay person. I didn't write it for professionals.
Sure.
I wrote it for the person who's in the pew, who cares about this, who wants to learn how to do this better, so that, and anybody who wants to read it and grow, they can. And I tried to write it in a popular format with plenty of stories and short chapters, so it's an easy read for folks to be able to work through. It's hard because you have to deal with the category of abuse.
Sure.
So it's, in that sense, that it's heavy as you work through some of the difficult stories that are in there. But we wrote it, and I wrote it in a way to be able to equip anyone who goes to a church on a Sunday morning who wants help.
Yeah.
And I think you did a great job of that, because it's very relatable. The stories make it more real to what could happen in my church, and just it draws that connection to be able to say, okay, I could see this happening. And there were several illustrations that you added where I was like, wow, we had something very similar happen, and it happens, every Sunday across the country. So, Mike, you were gonna.
Yeah, I'd throw one last question out there. Given your experience with this, Deepak, and what you've seen in the journey that you guys have gone on, the research that you've completed, for our audience out there, speak to those folks that maybe are just getting started, or those folks that may have started and are now losing heart because they're daunted by how much work it actually is. If you could kind of maybe speak from your expertise with some encouragement for the folks that are kind of stepping foot onto this journey.
Yeah, well, I would say as a father and then as a pastor, my motivation is when I drop my kids off every Sunday morning. It's like I started all this not because I'm a pastor, but because my kids themselves are participating in children's ministry. And so if I can do everything within my power to make this the most safe place on the planet for my kid, then I'm going to do it.
Yep.
And that's the motivation that often flows out of it. Like, just stare at a kid and recognize the kind of difficult world that they're facing that's very different than the world that we grew up in. And recognize that, I have within my power, God has given me the ability to make some choices in a local church that can actually make their life better, not worse. And through the work of the Spirit, through the power of God's word, through church community, and through people being willing to make sacrifices for the sake of these kids, we can actually make a difference. So I don't know all the benefits of taking the time to think through this and protect for our kids or help other churches, but I'm looking forward to getting to glory and finding out actually when the curtains pull back and we get to see, wow, I didn't realize this and this and this and this happened. That God worked in those ways. So everyday people don't have to have professional degrees or professional training in order to begin to make decisions for their own local church that can actually make the environment for their kids safer. And what I said earlier, there are certain choices you can make. You can't do everything. I offer the Cadillac version in the book. Not everybody can do that. But you pick a few things, you begin to reduce the risk that's there for your children being under some kind of evil that could get through and abuse them. So that in that sense, anybody who attends a local church can pick up the book, read it, and begin to start a dialogue with other people in their church, especially the leadership. The best way to do it is not just read the book and get excited, but read the book and go to your pastor and say, would you read it with me?
Sure.
Start a dialogue with the leadership of your church.
Mm-hmm.
And as soon as they get on board, then things begin to happen overall. So read together and think together, and most importantly, pray together. The Lord could do a lot more than we ever expect.
Amen.
But it happens when we read, think, pray, prepare for the difficult things that we experience here in a fallen world.
For sure.
Absolutely.
For sure. All right. Well, for sake of time, we probably need to wrap it up, but I think we could probably go another hour anyway. This is awesome.
We could. Yep.
But anyhow, thank you again, sir, for joining us, and we're grateful, and regularly pray for you and your ministry. So in DC. So But if there's anything, is there a website or anything that that you'd like to share where folks can reach out to you?
Well, I mean, I don't have my own personal website, but the church website, capitalbaptist.org,
Okay.
is where they can find our church staff and the church overall. And I blog a lot for a number of different ministries, but I would say if you're ever through Washington, D.C., come join us for church on Sunday morning. 800 gathering Sunday. And anytime you see a shot of the U.S. Capitol building on the generic news, when they talk about the Congress and Supreme Court, well, pray for us. We don't have anybody famous coming to our church, but we have all their cronies that attend. All the junior staff and
Staffers.
chief
Yeah.
of staffers. They're the ones who come to our church. And, we don't have just Republicans or Democrats. We have both because we're gospel centered. And so people down the street who fight with each other during Monday through Friday come and together
That's
are committed
awesome.
to the gospel on Sunday morning. Those are the people we're ministering to. So if you ever see the generic shot of the Supreme Court building, U.S. Capitol building, pray for us. Pray for our ministry.
We will definitely do that.
That's great.
All right. All right. So you've been listening to our broadcast, Keeping Kids Safe, and we've been talking with Pastor Deepak Raju. And this will be uploaded into YouTube and then also on our website, and then later on to all of our podcast platforms. So if you missed part of it, you're welcome to go back and listen to it. So great stuff. As always, you can reach out to us through our website if we can help you or your ministry. Our website is churchsafetyguys.com. So feel free to reach out to us through that, and have a great week.
I was going to actually put in a quick plug for the conference. We're going to you'll be coming down, and we'll be in Dallas area, Texas, in a couple of weeks.
August
about a
13th.
month now. We're coming up on a month. August 13th, and that is let me get the acronym right, National Organization of Church Safety and Security Management Conference.
I believe so. NOCCSM. Okay. So, but yes, we'll have a table down there. We'll be down there for the day. I almost forgot next week, and we have it posted in our church safety and security group. But next week there is a webinar that I'm actually doing with Checker, the background check company, and that is free. I think it's around lunchtime on Thursday, but you're welcome to sign up and enroll. And I'm going to be on there, and also Jeff from ECAP is actually joining me, and we'll be talking about the same topic, keeping kids safe. And there's some great speakers on there, great folks that have a heart for ministry and kids ministry. And so we'll be talking about that again as well. So another great free resource. As always, you can download the church security app. There's some great stuff on there. And then one of the new things that we just added was a patron membership. So if you go to our website, on the top upper right-hand corner, you'll see CSG membership plus, or CSG patron membership plus. You can click on that and it goes to the patron site, and that accesses some of the services that we provide churches and individuals, and all of our past broadcasts. And so you can go on there and actually sign up to access past topics or hear previous discussions. And that actually has all of our broadcasts on it. So if you're looking for one place to go, then that would be the place to kind of see everything. And we do ask, the part of the membership, we do ask a donation for that. But the donation, again, 100% of that, just like the books and everything else, goes straight back into the ministry. Mike and I do not take a paycheck. And this is just our mission and ministry and passion to serve and help churches. I used to say around the U.S., and now it's quickly becoming around the world. So I'm still very humbled by that, but
Kind of
Good
blows
stuff.
my mind. It's with the emails and different things coming in, and like, wait, you got an email from where this week? And
Yeah.
it just, yeah, it's pretty amazing. But
It's good
praise God
stuff.
for what He's doing, and it puts us in a position to be able to have folks like Deepak on tonight, and the paths being crossed, and working with folks like Jeff from ECAP, and there's just so many
Sure.
folks we've had a chance to meet, and so many churches we get a chance to talk to on a weekly basis, and it's pretty amazing to be able to do that, and humbling to be part of that, and really give back in any way we can, and sometimes that's a short conversation of, hey, here's how we think you should handle this, to a much longer coaching conversation that becomes an engagement that we'll sit down with a church on an ongoing basis and help them work through bigger struggles, foundational challenges of getting started the right way. So there's a lot of different ways that we can help your church if you have a need. So reach out.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's funny. A lot of times people think that it's all okay. It's this formal thing. And, we talk to a lot of pastors where we'll say, hey, we're going in this area of the country. Can we swing by your church and just say hello? And oftentimes they will. And I've had folks reach out to me and say, hey, I saw you're going to Michigan. You want to swing by our church and see how we do safety. And I love that. I love the opportunity to walk other churches and learn and see how people are doing stuff. And so it's definitely good stuff. And a lot of times pastors just need encouragement as well. They like having an outside resource where they'll call us or like Mike said, email, and they'll just ask a simple question. It's like a 5-minute, hey, I'm handling this way. This is how I handled it. What do you think? How would you guys do it? And we're always honored to be asked, but at the same time, sometimes it's not problem solving as much as it's just being available to say, you know what? Yeah, you're doing a fantastic job, and you're doing that the right way, and it's God honoring, and and pastors are people too. They need that.
Right.
They need that encouragement. So
we would hope there'd be enough folks that these churches are connected with locally to be able to ask their peer on another church safety team to say, hey, across town, what does that look like? Or, hey, I'm struggling with this. What do you think? But that doesn't always work. I mean, we encourage that. We certainly pray that happens, that you build those connections, those coalitions, those friendships. But certainly if that doesn't exist, you have folks that are willing to listen and willing to provide that feedback. So don't feel like you're alone.
For sure. All right. Well, next week, I believe we have, if I'm correct, I believe we have Chuck from NOCCSM coming on, and we'll be talking more about the specifics on the conference in Dallas and who we have coming in and who he's got coming in and that sort of thing. But yeah, reach out. If you're in Texas, we will be there for the day, and we'll have a table, and we'd love to talk with you. So stop by and we'd love to chat with you for a few minutes. So. Yep. But until next week, take care. God bless. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for joining the Church Safety and Security broadcast with the Church Safety Guys, sponsored by Checker. We hope that you found it informative, and we appreciate your feedback. Be sure to share our broadcast with your teams. Join the discussion online, and for other great resources, download the Church Security app or visit our website at churchsafetyguys.com. Remember, keep a servant's heart, a mindset of ministry, and Semper Disciplina. Always be training. Have a blessed week.